The Astronauts, continued by Stanislaw Lem, translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The city. The cosmic crater described large circles around Venus at an altitude of 40 kilometers. In the thin atmosphere, condensed vapor formed around the glowing exhaust gases, hanging motionless above the clouds as a giant ring of fog, and glittering like a rainbow under the rays of the low-flying sun. As we, constantly circling, returned on our own track. We had already been racing around the planet for many hours. Approximately every 45 minutes, the sun appeared in the fluorescent screens, bathing the walls of the control center in blinding light, and disappeared again. The engines sang their soft, monotonous song, and below stretched the unclouded, snow-white plain of clouds. I took turns with Soltic at the controls. During off-duty hours, I met Arseniev several times. He paced the center aisle of the rocket, his face grim, his hands behind his back. Once I spoke to him, but he didn't answer, but disappeared into the Marek's cabin, above whose door the red sign glowed continuously again. A little later, I saw Rayner. He was bringing a film cassette from the laboratory. As he passed, he only glanced at me with an absent gaze. An hour later, when I passed the laboratory again, I heard music. I carefully opened the door and entered. From the loudspeaker came the majestic sounds of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Chandrasekhar stood next to the apparatus, motionless as a statue. I didn't move until the music had stopped. The mathematician remained in his position, his head slightly raised, as if listening to the silence that surrounded us. "Professor," I said quietly. Only now did he notice me. "Excuse me?" "I wanted to, may I ask, what are you currently working on?" "He's playing with us like a cat with a mouse," Chandrasekhar muttered, walking past me toward the door. "Who, Arseniev?" I asked. "But no, Marax. I learned nothing more from him. I returned to the control center. It had become dark night. The lamps on the measuring instruments flickered, casting a vague faint glow against the walls. In the background, the Marax's control instruments flashed brightly, as if it alone were awake in the giant rocket, which was sunk in a deep sleep. This calm, however, was only apparent. As I re-entered the corridor, I heard the scientists excitedly discussing something. I distinguished Arseniev's baritone. Lao Tzu answered him in a calm, dispassionate voice. There were still 2 hours until my shift. However, I didn't feel like going back to my cabin, so I went back to the control center. Soltic sat on the Marax's control panels, bathed in their bright light, and carefully examined a large sheet of paper that looked like a city map. "What's that?" I asked him. "Warsaw," he replied, without raising his head. He slowly traced the map with his finger, and made a mistake, and then, like the wandering, he probably took his mind through the city's ruins. We turned to the starting point to search for the lost path. "Is that your hometown?" "I've never been there. Tell me about Warsaw." He looked at me distractedly, then turned back to his map. "You've never been to Warsaw?" he asked me, as if he were saying, "You've never seen the sun?" I sat on the arm of the chair and looked at the multicolored polygons. Soltic carefully folded the sheet. "When I think of the Earth," he said, "I think of Warsaw. Then—" he paused. "There are much larger cities." Again he hesitated. and much more magnificent. But it is very beautiful. We were both silent. For a moment, white towering walls appeared before me, above the green of the trees. Suddenly, the loud buzzer signal sounded. I jumped. The engineer pointed up to the marks as measuring instruments. See, it hasn't stopped once in 16 hours. Salter picked up the receiver. Arsenyev answered and asked me to come into the cabin immediately, with the tools, as if there was something wrong with the Marx's cooling system. Arsenyev, Chandrasekhar, and Lao Tzu were in the cabin. The smell of overheated wires still hung in the air. The red signals of the block switches glowed in long rows. Arsenyev paced back and forth between the open distribution panels. It turned out that a pump in the cooling system had failed, causing the temperature in the pipes to rise above the safety limit. Nevertheless, the scientists hadn't switched off the marks until the calculations were completed. I spent a quarter of an hour busy among the huge capacitors. Then I climbed through narrow shafts under the floor of the cabin, where the centrifugal pumps were located. There, amidst all the cables that wound above and around me, like the roots of a tree, I replaced the overheated bearing in unbearable heat and confinement. When the damage was repaired and I was just about to leave the cabin, Arsenyev stopped in his walk and stood in front of me. You know that we're crossing over the dead forest? Yes. What do you think about its origin? I'm not an expert, not a geologist, so that's okay. You've had some thought of it. Well, go ahead and say it. Perhaps it's the bottom of a sea that has gradually dried out. And in the process, the salts dissolved in the water have crystallized into these strange formations. In short, you consider it a geological formation? Yes. Yes, the astronomer repeated thoughtfully. Then he began pacing up and down in the cabin again. I was still standing there with the tools in my hand. The natural formation of such crystals is impossible. So they are artificial formations. Artificial, yes, but not intentional. I don't understand that. We couldn't understand it for a long time either. Whenever we come across any work of living beings, we always try to understand its purpose. The dead forest wasn't dead at the time it was built. It is the ruin of a gigantic accumulator for radiant energy and probably just one of many. Do you also know what purpose it served? We put this very question to Marx many times. We gave him the structure, the dimensions, the type of material on which the dead forest is constructed, and he strove, like an engineer, to compile the technical data into a logical whole. As long as we didn't know any details, many possibilities for synthesis were open to Marx, so to speak. He replied that the forest could have been a device for modifying the climate, or a giant chemical transmutator designed to regulate the composition of the atmosphere. But as new facts became known to us, one hypothesis after another fell away. The energy stored in the dead forest exceeded the needs of the facilities I just mentioned by thousands of times. Now Marx began working towards a very specific solution. However, we could not agree with him and endeavored to redirect his conclusions. He put forward the most complicated hypotheses, examined their validity, and ultimately always answered with a no. Arsenyev stopped in front of the extinguished cathode screen. He turned his back to me as he continued. I won't soon forget this hour. He stubbornly returned to the same direction. I had the impression that this was nothing but the machinations of the object that had previously had to obey us was now taking revenge. As you know, Marx doesn't answer with words, but with curves. but these were so clear, so unambiguous. He didn't finish his sentence, and turned to the physicist, who was, with the help of a small apparatus, was checking the course of a curve on a diagram. "I envy your calm, Lau," he said. "You have little reason to envy me," retorted the Chinese. "It's true that the path from my head to my heart runs far from my face, but it wasn't any easier for me than it was for you." Arsenyev looked into the shiny surface of the screen, as if looked at himself in a mirror. Suddenly he turned round. When the words of the declaration were spoken, it became clear that we had all expected them from the beginning, for only no one wanted to be the first to say them. "And what were those words, Professor?" "Destruction of life on Earth," said the astronomer. He remained motionless for a while in the silence that followed his words. Then he resumed his walk. "In the dead forest, in the ruin of is the ruin of a catapult that was supposed to project radioactive charges onto Earth." Into the deathly silence, Arseniev's footsteps sounded like the steady pendulum of a clock. I clearly heard the sound of the curve gauge sliding across the paper in the physicist's hands. "I've instructed Soltec to change course," the astronomer said after a while in a calm voice. "We're now flying to where the control tubes to the dead forest come from." I didn't move from the spot. Slowly and hard. My heart began to pound, as if before a battle. "Professor, if they—" "Don't ask. I won't tell you anything more for now. Come with me to the control center. We've already covered 700 kilometers and should be at our destination soon." We walked down the corridor in silence. In the control center, Arsenyev looked at the measuring instruments, then turned to Soltic. "We're now descending 6,000 meters." He checked the course we were supposed to follow. "If we see any light, please call me." "What kind of light, Professor?" I asked. "You'll see." He left the control center with the Chinese man. Soltic adjusted the corresponding levers on the predictor. The rocket lost altitude, and thus the stars disappeared again. The television screens darkened until they were filled with impenetrable darkness. We switched the radar, but the greenish light that now covered the screens only confused us. For a while we continued flying blind. Then, in the uniform darkness, a grey shimmer appeared, as if day were already dawning again, although night had only begun a few dozen hours ago. We notified Arsenyev. He ordered us to go even lower. The rocket descended rapidly to 4,000, 3,000, and finally 2,000 meters. From the east, a motionless grey glow penetrated the haze. Below us, shrouded in darkness, the vast plain sped by. I stood between Arsenyev and Soltek in front of the light screens. We prepared for landing. For a few seconds, the cosmic crater slumped downward in a steep banked curve, like a knife falling to the ground. Suddenly, a sudden tugging and jerking went through its fuselage. Flames tore through the darkness. In the thunder of the braking engines, the rocket sped along low over the ground. Magnesium flares, flying in bundles in all directions, illuminated endless rows of dunes that seemed to undulate like ocean waves in the flickering, shimmering light. The floor hatches opened. The rows of widely spaced caterpillar tracks whistled through the air. Once again the bow thrusters roared, then a faint but clearly perceptible tremor ran through the fuselage. The front pair of tracks had brushed the edge of a dune. A powerful thrust, and the rocket rolled across the ground with a piercing clang and rattle. It settled ever more heavily onto the chassis. Sand lashed the tank and covered it with a dull roar. The ground beneath our feet shook and leaped upwards with every unevenness in the terrain, as if the rocket were about to take flight again. but these movements soon faded into the gentle rocking. The cosmic crater tilted downward one last time, righted itself again, and stood still. In the silence, only the hiss of the compressed air filling the shock absorber cylinders could be heard. After just under half an hour, the floor flaps slid aside. A vehicle rattled along a lowered, sloping ramp on caterpillar tracks. I was at the wheel, with Arsenyev next to me, who had the radiation meter at his fingertips. Soltic and Rayner stood behind us, leaning on the arms of a vertical column, the radiation detector. They could observe the area through the upper windows without losing sight of the instruments mounted on the walls. The small vehicle slowly worked its way out of the deep trench that the cosmic crater had ploughed into the loose sand layers. The light from the headlights revealed a gloomy, monotonous landscape, flat as far as the eye could see, and interspersed with low waves of yellowish-brown, fine-grained sand. Here and there a smooth, coarse boulder still defied the weathering. We had the wind at our backs. Swirling, it drove the light sand of the dunes, before it driving it in thick clouds of dust against the metal walls of our vehicle. Here and there, jagged limestone cliffs rose up among smaller fragments. Although they were in the light of our reflectors, they cast long, flat shadows that ran opposite in our direction of travel. After a while, we approached a low dam at an acute angle. The slope facing the wind was hard, as if packed firmly. As we drove up, we saw that the crest of the dam had curved inward, forming a shallow channel. It seemed to be a kind of punishment in any case. We could drive much faster on the small, crumbled stones, mixed with dry, dark clay that covered the ground, than on the sand. The light already took up half the sky, silver, reaching up to the clouds. It stood directly above us. The dam grew steadily bigger, higher, until it finally was the same height as the ground. After 10 minutes of fast driving, a whitish strip appeared on the horizon, illuminated from the ground. When we reached the crest of one of the last dunes, a view into the depths opened up. A sea of strange formations, which seemed to us like the characters of an unknown script, stretched out as far as the eye could see. Star-shaped, multi-segmented spires, torsos, stalagmite-like towers, rotundas with sunken, leaning walls, terraced bastions, blurred silhouettes, dissolving in the background. High above them, the arched arches of white viaducts swung together to form a radial network of massive overpasses. And all of this was illuminated by a bluish glow that encircled the horizon like a giant crescent. The city, I whispered, and my hand involuntarily throttled the engine. The car stopped above the slope of the dune. The sand rays behind the beam of the headlights were now also illuminated by the ghostly half-light. I looked at the astronomer. Shall we continue? Of course. That's why we came here from Earth, Arsenyev replied. I released the brake. The vehicle rolled down the slope, and the engine rumbled and pulled away. I accelerated, but Arsenyev touched my arm and asked me to slow down. I leaned forward to see as wide a space as possible through the windshield. We were now traveling at a maximum of 20 kilometers per hour. The engine ran very quietly. Only the tracks clanged and crunched as they crushed splintering, crumbling shards. Suddenly there was a rattling and crackling sound beneath us, as if we were rolling over sheet metal. I directed the spotlight toward the ground, and in its beam of light, a perfectly straight, bright strip became visible. A path. It was covered with a layer of sand, beneath which cracked, flat, dark slabs peeped out. On both sides, long, unfurling coils appeared on conical slopes. As I got closer, I could distinguish that they were bundles of pipes hanging from a well shaft, formed by a luminous ring. A little further away, I saw the first buildings. Some rose in terraced stories, some were completely smooth, like rows of books. In others, the walls were divided into now alternating concave and convex sections. I noticed that some shapes were repeated. These three strange columns, in particular, stuck in my memory. They stood equidistant from each other, and from each protruded on three sides glassy, luminous fins. The columns bore capitals curved like beaks. The path now forked to the left and right in invisible half-darkness. The circular hollows of tunnels glided past, leading into the depths. Increasingly, second and third-tiered streets spanned the lower structures in the high arches. We drove through a horseshoe gate supported by undulating two-pronged pillars. A little further on, beneath three columns connected by slender yoke arches in the shape of a triangle, the path forked again. On the left it rose high in serpentines, like bricks to the sky, darkly standing out against the brightly lit bluish background. On the right it formed a high avenue between vertical lights. I chose the avenue. The buildings grew ever higher and higher, but no trace of doors or windows could be discovered. Everywhere only smooth, luminous walls glided, some flat and some curved inward. Giant pipes appeared again. They emerged from the ground and arched in steep arcs across the street, disappearing into round shafts on the other side. Driving became increasingly difficult. The tracks squealed and slipped. The entire vehicle trembled as they crushed the shards which shimmered brightly under the beams of the headlights. Here and there we rolled over fragments and trimmers that shattered with a glassy clatter. And then again, the tracks had to dig hundreds of meters through loose, heavy sand. The avenue ended. We found ourselves in a square surrounded by giant white houses. At first it seemed to me as if the buildings rested on long colonnades. As we got closer, I saw that the columns weren't supporting the facades, but hung with their tips downward like a row of enormous icicles. Only now did I notice that the exit was blocked by mountains of dark debris. The left track became entangled in some cobweb-like tangled wires. The car spun around and the engine stalled. For a few seconds there was a dull silence. In silence we approached the windows with our helmets. Around us stood bluish giants, and below lay deep shadows, furrowed by the yellow beams of our headlights, which shone on a mountain of rubble and debris. I restarted the engine and shifted into reverse. With a roar, the car drove right up to a high vertical wall. Its light penetrated the windows into the car's interior. For a while, bluish flames flickered on our helmets. I turned around. When we were back on the avenue, I chose a different route. A wide serpentine took us to the upper penalty level. The engine ran smoothly and quietly. Enamel-hard chunks of rock continually crunched and splintered beneath the tracks. We drove about 60 or 70 meters above the lower penalty level. On both sides, horseshoe-shaped overpasses and egg-shaped domes glided by, occasionally a flat disc resting on large pillars. tilted like the face of an apocalyptic sundial. Then again, we saw buildings that resembled books, and those with vertical rows of hemispherical bulges surrounded by bundles of smooth pipes. The engine hummed. We drove over traffic lights, and the same picture presented itself again and again. An endless silent city shining through darkness. Only the crackling and rattling of the rubble under the caterpillars broke the dull stillness. The blocks of houses receded, hiding behind one another, and we were replaced by others, so large and tall that the cold gleam of their tops was sometimes obscured by the mist descending from the invisible sky. Beyond an intersection, our traffic lights descended into gentle curves and opened onto a square surrounded by a wide, loose ring of buildings. From the height of the upper level of the penitentiary, they made an even more monumental impression than the others, and up close they presented a very threatening sight. A dense network of blackish cracks covered them. Here and there entire walls had sunk in, like heated sheets of wax, and thick webs of building material melted into glass clung to them. We crossed the square and entered a narrow passage between two wings of a gigantic structure that seemed to reach up into the clouds. In the distance, veritable torchlight trails of high and low light shone. The outlines of the buildings beside us became increasingly blurred. Some were strangely dented, twisted and swollen. From the walls of others hung sheets of the luminous mass, rolled to the side, twisted into tubes and horns, radiating light even as finely ground dust. Even the tracks of our vehicles, whirling hastily around their axes, began to shimmer from this dust. During the endless journey, I was occasionally overcome by the idea that everything I had seen so far was nothing but an inexplicable accumulation of diversely shaped minerals, deposits accumulating through entire epochs, layers of gigantic crystals melted by volcanic fire, cracked and weathered in the hurricanes of the desert. But then among the debris a piece of pavement appeared, smooth as polished glass, or the stump of a reed flickered past at the corner, with clear traces of curvature on its curved surface, undeniable evidence of the work of some living creature, and I opened my eyes even wider and pressed my helmet even closer to the window, to finally catch a glimpse of at least one inhabitant of this silent, magnificently illuminated city. The shapes we passed became ever more grotesque, ever more sinister. Among the glowing plates, dark coils writhed down like shredded antennae, like snakes. They were torn cables. As the train crossed the dark silhouette of a bridge, it seemed to me as if the gigantic animal bodies lay beside its pillars, reflecting the light, shining silvery like the backs of large fish. Seen from close up, they were dangling structural components, and beneath them long flattened spindles piled up in piles, surrounded by bent, tangled, spiral-shaped collars. Beneath the ruins of this bridge, we sank for a while into complete darkness, into which the headlights ploughed two yellow tracks, and from which we only emerged again, beyond the bridge. Here no trace of a ridge remained. Even the rubble had encrusted into a half-glassy, half-slag-like mass. Sliding again and again, the caterpillars crushed into thin cover with a hellish crunching sound. From the distance, mighty smooth walls and ramparts shimmered, strikingly resembling mountain ranges. Around us spread a desolation in which enormous blocks of houses rose, as if in the instant of melting they had been intertwined in strange coils and solidified into ice. Hot tears from a giant candle that had burned to its end, dripping down and then cooling down. Everywhere, skeletal fragments of structures stared into the air. Torn and shattered, they shone with their brownish-red rust marks in this desert where the beams of our headlights hit them. The darkness of the night, driven into the heights of the cloud by the tall lights of the houses in the streets, descended here to the ground. As we swerved sideways around the shallow crater, two hunched figures suddenly moved in the headlights. I braked with all my might, put the car into reverse, and reversed the car. At the same time, I directed one of the headlights toward the side. The outlines of the two dwarfs stood out against the bluish background of the wall. I intensified their light. They were column stumps, half peeping out of the rubble. A little further on, the buildings disappeared as if they had been excavated. Only in the distance did they encircle the dark, empty space like a bright ring. At the spot we were driving over, the entire ground shimmered in a scattered, muted glow. The phosphorescent enamel and dust here was mixed with fine sand and round lumps that were neither stone nor metal. Driving became torture, especially as the flat surface now gave way to low but steep slopes. The engine roared, the tracks stretched to the breaking point, clanged piercingly as they dug into the ground, often open to the axles. Suddenly the engine roared as if liberated, propelling the car forward. We had reached the top of the elevation. I pressed the brake lever. Below us yawned a shallow crater, emitting an indefinable tribal light. Its walls were mottled and full of dirty violet, yellowish and green infiltrations that looked like mold. In the depths of the smooth, collapsed ground, the mass, as if encased in amber, all sorts of strange shapes. Intertwined veins, distorted, twisted shadows, torsos, figures. What does all this mean? Where are we exactly? I wanted to ask, but no words came out of my clenched throat. One of my companions touched my arm and signaled me to turn around. I nodded silently and started the engine. The car slowly moved away from the edge of the debris field. Behind the windows, black shattered walls, tenant-covered blocks crawled past. What seemed to be the melted fragments of enormous machinery. Finally, we reached the bottom of the road again. Rocking gently over bumps, our car drove along the foundations of large buildings. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I stared ahead of me and listened to the steady hum of the engine. The roads wound endlessly, spanned by other roads. From above, huge smooth walls, rounded corners and projections, pillars and pillars, cast their light down. I couldn't tear my gaze away from this immense sequence of majestic, immobile forms. It was as if they wanted to last for eternity, filling the night with their everlasting radiance. Numbed by the overload of impressions, I was no longer able to think clearly. At times I even forgot my companion sitting close to me. We had been driving through the darkness, not for hours, but for years, or so it seemed to me. When I turned around once and noticed that Raina and Arsenyev were noting down the readings from the instruments and comparing the movements of the needles on the radiation indicators, as if in a laboratory, I found it incomprehensible that they could think of anything other than the silent glow that was behind the windows of our car. During the last quarter of an hour of this journey, the astronomer touched my arm every few moments and ordered me to turn right and then left again. At first it wasn't clear to me what he was guided by when choosing his route, but then I saw how attentively he was watching the dial on the induction device. When we entered the wider street, Arsenyev asked me to stop. The engine stopped. We instinctively tightened the helmet clips and climbed out of the car through the roof hatch. The floor here was covered with fine filings, shining so brightly as if a silver spark had been melted into each one. The crunch of our footsteps echoed loudly in the empty street. Sometimes the wind chased clouds of dust from the stone slabs and shrilled high above like ripping tin. Above us, a bundle of shattered arm-thick wires hung from the sides of a glassy structure. A little further on, above a low block of houses, a building slumped in the middle, its front flanking the bend in the street. In the background, the tunnel forked into three branches. Two led higher, the third emptied into a tunnel that turned its enormous glowing jaws towards us, its interior narrowing like a conch shell. Arsenyev looked at the indicator for a while. Then he took Rayner's induction apparatus, slung it over his shoulder, and called us over. Last to arrive was Saltic. Until now he had been standing by the machine, trying to direct the searchlight's lights into the depths of the tunnel. We'll need tools, Arsenyev said. Ever since we got out, a constant, faint, annoying crackling sound filled the cabin. To understand each other better, we had to put on our heads together. Above all, a winch, crowbars, and fulgurite, the astronomer continued. All of this has to be brought here from the rocket. He looked at us in turn, finally deciding. Smith will stay with me, and Saltic and Rayner will return to the rocket. I'll send you both because Osvitich is bedridden, and Lauchu isn't feeling much better. He looked at his watch. The round trip shouldn't take more than 3 hours, including the time required to load the equipment. Should I go right away? Saltic took a step toward the truck. Yes. The engineer got in first. Then Rayner followed and slammed the hatch behind him. The engine started, and the car began to move, rocking slightly. We watched it until it disappeared around the bend. A few times we heard the engine roar. Probably the car was driving over sand dunes or rubble. Then everything fell silent. Only the wind whistled high above us. Professor, I said. He didn't answer. The crackling sound reached my ears incessantly. It was as if someone were shaking poppy seeds onto the membrane. Professor, I repeated louder. Where are they? This time he understood me. He came closer. The window of his helmet was in shadow, and so I was startled by the familiar sight of the helmet with the protruding radar antennas. A mad doubt shot through me as to whether that was really Arsenyev, my companion, a human being. But then I saw his bright, clear eyes through the glass of the helmet. They're dead, perished, he said. All dead. And how did it happen? I don't know. Don't ask any more questions now. The induction device indicates that underground lines run very close by. Is that why we stopped here? Yes. I'm looking for the main cable of the power grid. It's possible that we'll be able to reach the place where it all begins. The astronomer was silent for a while, then continued. We must split up now. Each of us walks 400 paces further, then returns in a spiral line and looks for the acoustic echo. Whoever finds it first notifies the other with red rockets. The radio connection is unreliable. Is everything clear? Yes. He turned and walked away with long, springy strides. I looked at the dial of the gyrocompass and marched to the other side. When I turned off the power of the radio, the sound of the iron-shod shoes reverberated with twice the force on the stone slabs. Swaying back and forth, my shadow glided across the pavement. I felt the ground with my induction detector and counted the steps. When I reached 400, I spiraled back. At first I saw nothing. The red eye inside the helmet glowed only faintly, so there were only slight traces of radioactivity. Its intensity increased as I approached the walls. I raised my head. The bright bastions up there stood out sharply against the pitch-black sky. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. Arsenyev had gone in the opposite direction, the same direction the car had left. I knew that no one except us was in this part of town, that no one could be behind me, and yet I heard footsteps. They didn't sound very loud, as if someone was following me at a distance of about 30 meters. It felt as if hundreds of fine needles were stabbing me in the back, and I had to summon all my willpower not to turn around. I kept going. All was a steady clatter behind me. 1, 2, 1, 2. Louder when the surface of the punishment was clear. Quieter when it was covered with blown-in sand. Perhaps it was just the echo after all. I stepped more forcefully. The footsteps of the person walking behind me didn't sound any louder. It was an echo. Sweat ran down my face. I was now completely certain that something was coming behind me, and it couldn't be a person. I stopped. The others' footsteps also fell silent. I kept going, and there they were again. Anger gripped me. I yanked the ray gun from my shoulder, spun round, and aimed. The street was empty. In the bright light of the walls, I saw it narrowing more and more in the distance, until it converged with other lights. For a long time I gazed around, as if in a daze. Then I slung the ray gun over my shoulder again, walked on, heard footsteps, stopped, pulled it down again, and then there was another footstep, a second, a third. Damn it, the sounds I had taken for footsteps were caused by the rhythmic clanging of a belt buckle close to my ear. Ashamed, I turned around again. 3 red flames rose up behind the buildings, one after the other. They hung in the air for a while and then slowly slid to the ground, trailing a trail of purple sparks. I hurried on. It wasn't long before I saw Arsenyev standing on an elliptical rise in the ground. This seems to be it, he said. We turned sideways and came to the entrance of a shallow tunnel. Its opening was studded with short thorns and resembled a shark's mouth. It was dark. Arsenyev switched on his reflector, and we climbed inside. The path led in slanting spirals ever deeper beneath the surface. It seemed to have no end. From time to time we saw the oval mouths of other tunnels in the walls. Arsenyev then simply looked at the dial of the induction device. We followed the trail of the invisible line unblinkingly. Suddenly the ground beneath us emitted a different sound. We walked on metal. 3 thick pipes ran from one wall to the other, blocking our way. Our uncertain glow of light seeped through a gap. Only with difficulty did we manage to squeeze through. I was the first to stand up and had to squint, blinded by the glare. Ahead of us lay a sloping ramp flooded with light. After a few dozen steps, we stood in a hall of immense dimensions. The ceiling fluorescent with a constantly changing greenish glow, like the sunlit surface of the sea. The glow gradually grew stronger, and then weaker again. The hall was round and divided into 2 halves by projections on both sides. In the bright light I could see that the perception I had already had in the tunnel was not an illusion. The thin glaze on the stone walls proved that an incredible heat must have once reigned here. Beneath the projections lay partially melted cylinders made of a white mass reminiscent of porcelain. From the ceiling, dozens of torn cables hung from holes in which broken and melted tubes were still stuck. Some led to the cylinders and to a stool, exactly in the center of the ceiling, from which radiated horns. ended in spheres. But it wasn't this chaos of mysterious arrangements that caused us to stand petrified at the entrance. On the other side of the hall, shimmering blue and white, glowing serpentine lines glided across a large concave wall surface, merging here and there into clusters flickering and diverging in different directions like the animated stratum lines of a large map. It was a map, a large moving map. As I examined it more closely, I noticed that behind its glassy surface stretched a light-filled depth, full of luminous little sparks and large internally illuminated spheres rotating on their axes, moving away and approaching again, crossing their trajectories and illuminating each other. Arsenyev stood beside me. I heard his rapid breathing. Before us, stars circled in their orbits, clusters of stars, shattered large dark patches of nebulae, obscured pulsating hosts of stars. Where the light was only twilight, entire groups of stars rose and sank again. From time to time a bright ray shone through the room as if pursuing one of the planets. The map of Venus, however, moved slowly, ponderously, indifferently past. The outlines of unknown continents became visible. It was very hot in the vast space. At the ceiling the light flared up and faded again. On the floor our shadows blurred or sharpened in the same rhythm. Where are we? I hesitated. Is this a planetarium? The astronomer walked slowly and silently toward the center of the hall. Behind one of the two projections, a circular corridor opened. For a short stretch, its floor was illuminated by the light coming in from the hall. Arsenyev had already reached the center of the room when I turned around to take another look at this unusual planetarium. It looks like a firmament. Stars, I said. But what does this flickering light, bright light line mean? Suddenly I jumped. Look, there, the Earth. I approached the transparent fluorescent screen, which had survived amidst the devastation. From the darkness the globe emerged with the pearly sheen of distant clouds. It slowly rotated on its axis, tilted against the ecliptic. Above him hung darkly the new moon. Through the star-filled space, a dimly glowing sphere came ever closer. Its orbit was already curving, but there, quite far below it, was Venus circling. I recognized it immediately by its much brighter radiance. Suddenly, a blindingly bright beam shot up from Venus, reached the Earth, and flooded the sea of clouds with a gruesome glow of flame. What was that? I whispered, grabbing Arsenyev by the arm. He silently raised his hand and pointed at something I hadn't noticed until now. Two crossed-out rings carved into the side of the wall. What does all this mean? Nothing more now, said Arsenyev. Nothing at all. It is only the powerless movement of a mechanism once set in motion, which will continue. He broke off without finishing the sentence, turned around, and stepped into the dark tunnel. It was so now that one could reach over both walls with outstretched arms. We climbed a few steps, formed by conical projections, placed side by side. The tunnel ran horizontally. In the distance the light appeared, coming towards us. It was the reflection of our reflector, a plate made of a glassy mass, precisely filtered into the round cross-section, closed off the tunnel. On one side of the wall there was a bulge. Was there supposed to be a hinge there? Arsenyev pressed against the plate. Whether the mechanism was no longer working, or we didn't understand how to operate it, it moved and didn't budge. The astronomer thought for a moment, then aimed the reflector at the obstacle. Although the glassy mass absorbed a large portion of the light, the continuation of the tunnel could be seen behind it. It widened out into a funnel. Let's use the ray gun, said Arsenyev. We retreated to the next bend. Arsenyev knelt down and gestured for me to do the same. I tried not to lose sight of the obstacle. The astronomer adjusted the distance by the reflector's light, aimed and fired. A yellow-violet flash shot through the tunnel. In an instant, the plate glowed red. Large cracks ran through it. Blinded, I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, Arsenyev fired a second time. Shards clanged shrilly and piercingly. We waited a few minutes until they had cooled. Arsenyev was the first to enter the widened part of the tunnel. Suddenly he stopped and raised his hand in warning. Be careful. A gentle breeze came from the depths. Then it was completely silent for a while. Immediately afterwards, the air moved again, but in the opposite direction. Breathe, I whispered involuntarily. These breaths repeated themselves regularly. Arsenyev stood there thoughtfully, considering what we should do. Then he said quietly, the ray gun. I held the shoulder strap, wrapped it around my wrist, and stood so close behind Arsenyev that I could touch his back. Suddenly it became dark around me. Bend down, Arsenyev whispered to me. It's getting tight in here. The rush of air flowing around us drew ever closer. It was exactly the time it took for a slow exhalation. Arsenyev hit the ceiling with his backpack. He tried to force his way through the corridor, but then took a step back. His broad shoulders blocked the entire passage. I reached out and fastened the straps. Hold my backpack, he begged me. I have to take it off, otherwise I won't be able to get through. I felt the straps pull my hands down. It was getting light again. Arsenyev had disappeared. I took a step forward. The dull roar suddenly grew louder. 2 meters in front of me, filled with violet light, lay a vast room. We stood in an opening that ended in front of a steeply sloping wall. It was the interior of an enormous sphere. Round dark cavities in evenly spaced circles yawned in the sphere's walls like the boxes of an eerie theatre. They were connected to the zenith of the dome by glass slits. These radiated a violet, pulsating light that flickered from dark embers to violent, glaring flares. I looked into the depths and grabbed Arsenyev by the arm. I almost lost my balance. I'm usually not afraid of heights, but here there was no floor. Down there, dark, slippery, shimmering, damp, tangled shapes, crisscrossed with silvery furrows, rolled over and through each other like thousands of seals in a basin that had been drained of water. The mushy black mass didn't flow. It pushed out of the openings below us and poured out. No, it slid into the basin. At times it resembled arms clinging to the opening, especially when the level in the collecting basin sank lower. Then the streams became thinner. Sometimes they even broke off. But immediately afterwards the entire mass hummed, swelling, rising higher and higher. The shreds rise in the air like snake bodies, and then join themselves again. For a long time we stood at the edge of the cauldron. The air flowed up and down, always following the movement of the black mass, and in the same rhythm the violet light flickered. Plasma, I whispered. The plasma of the living black river. Yes, replied the astronomer, the same. But it's just a tool. Why a tool? Well, when we think of the generation of electricity, we see machines, dynamos, atomic columns, but it can also be done differently. The particles of this plasma generate electrical charges, and these, transmitted thousands of kilometers away, act on the base of the white sphere. Professor, you were looking at this spot here. You expected what you see here? Yes, because the source had to be somewhere. The source of electricity electrical energy and gravity. And why? Why did they perish? The astronomer stared silently into the depths where the dark plasma surged. Professor, look at this movement. It is free and unhindered now. It serves no one anymore. This mass down there will rise and fall as long as the stored reserves last. But perhaps 100, 200, perhaps 500 years. His voice was hoarse. I didn't ask any more questions. He knelt down on the outer edge to get a better look into the depths. I did the same. The viscous, shining sea rose ever higher, slid softly and smoothly up the walls, swelled into a black 1,000-ton muscle, solidified, and began to sink again. We have no business here anymore. Let's turn back, said Arsenyev, rising. He switched on the reflector, and we went back. After 10 minutes, we were back in the large hall. As we passed the planetarium, where the glowing spheres were still orbiting, I involuntarily glanced at the black symbol of the double ring carved into the stone. I stopped. A memory surfaced. The same drawing was in the grotto. Venus and the Earth orbiting the Sun. There the strong line connected the two planets. Here, however, it began at Venus, strung towards the Earth, and passed over it, as if it were erasing the Earth from existence. Professor, I cried. My thoughts plunged into a bottomless abyss. Professor, I cried again. But the astronomer had already left the hall. His footsteps sounded increasingly distant and fainter from the depths of the tunnel.